Thank you. I think the global financial crisis invites a rethinking of the relationship between law and economics. And I've tried to provide some of this rethinking in a book called The Economic Dynamics of Law. Before I talk about the economic dynamics of law, however, I would like to say a few words about Guido. He's an extraordinary, vivacious, and kind man. I first experienced the vivacity as a student in his torts class. And a ton of law professors have passed through that tort class, many of them more prominent than I. So I was sort of amazed when I was promoted to university professor at Syracuse University that I got a congratulatory note, a very kind, nicely worded congratulatory note from Guido Calabresi, who was by then a very busy Second Circuit judge. And I shouldn't have been surprised because he's done similar kind things before and since, for me and for many others, so much so that I wonder how the man finds time to sleep. So the first thing I'd like to say is when I think of Guido, I think of him first and foremost as an extraordinary human being. Our teachers' influence upon us is often subtle, sometimes without our awareness. I first read The Cost of Accidents in Guido's first year torts class. I thought I had retained only a few of the most basic lessons from it, but upon rereading it, I find some affinities between between Guido's work and the economic dynamics of law. And I can't tell you whether that's because I read and understood more than I thought, or retained and understood more than I thought, or whether it's because one can't say very much fundamental about economics that Guido has not anticipated to some degree. And this affinity is in two areas. First of all, there's a common meta-theoretical stance. Chicago School Law and Economics has tended to make law a colony of economics because it insisted on efficiency as, if not formally the only goal for law, the only one they're really interested in. And that's Guido, by contrast, as you heard yesterday, and you would see in The Cost of Accidents as well, has insisted that law has intrinsic and normatively valuable goals that reflect society's needs that have to be attended to. And he wants there to be a relationship between law and economics where the economics is deployed to help come to terms better with conflicting normative values within the law, as well as with efficiency. And I think in insisting on the normative values in the law remaining part of the equation, it's a lot in common with the economic dynamics of law. The other thing is methodological. Guido's work does not assume perfect information and perfect rationality. Instead, what you see in The Cost of Accidents is that pedestrians are assumed not to know exactly what the accident statistics look like. They might be prone to over-optimism as they step out into the street, and therefore we have to have some caution about the optimality of general deterrence. Now, I'm going to present to you in a minute an idea for being more rigorous about the analysis of economic incentives that's built on that idea that bounded rationality has to be the lens through which we evaluate the effects of legal rules, which I call economic dynamic analysis. Okay, so the approach I'm going to take to presenting the economic dynamics of law is I'm going to start by presenting the basics of the economic dynamic theory, contrasting that with the neoclassical theory. I'm then going to see how both play out in the financial crisis, and then this being a symposium in honor of Guido, whose home is in common law scholarship, I'm going to talk about what the economic dynamic theory might have to contribute to common law scholarship. The economic dynamic theory, it represents a proposal to have change in some ways of the focus, goals, and methods of law and economics. The focus is on the shape of change over time. That is, the assumption is that when laws are enacted or reformed, the reason is we see a negative trend developing, and the effort is to countervail that trend. This contrasts with a view of law as an analog to a mere transaction. Law is not a transaction. Law is a set of rules that remain in place for a very long period of time. As such, they provide a background and a framework against which transactions occur. And a lot of different transactions can occur under any given legal framework. So I think it's better to view law as focused primarily on change over time. I suggest a goal that the most important economic goal for law is to avoid systemic risks while keeping economic opportunity open. That is, we cannot expect government to assure our happiness or be perfectly efficient, but we do expect government, the minimum expectation we have of government is it's supposed to present disasters, whether those disasters are a financial crisis, a climate crisis, or a terrorist attack. That's one of our minimum expectations for government. So I think it is useful to focus on these sort of macroeconomic goals, and I have some doubts about the microeconomic approach by contrast. Now, the analysis I suggest is something I call economic dynamic analysis, and this builds on the neoclassical legal economic insight, or just the general law and economic insight for that matter, that economic incentives are important. And what you see in a lot of legal scholarship is somebody says, well, law X provides an incentive to do Y. End of story. Now, I don't think that's sufficient. So if you say, well, there's a tax on marriage, this is a phenomenon in the U.S. tax code where it turns out that married couples pay more very often on their income tax than two people living together who are not married and filed separately. And so they'd said, well, this provides a disincentive to marry. Okay. But if you're seriously interested in law's effects, you have to ask a further question, which is, will couples contemplating marriage pay any attention to the tax code? That is, what does the bounds of their rationality look like for the target group for the law? And if the answer is that they do not look at the tax code, then this will not have any effect on marriage rates. Now, on the other hand, if it turns out that married couples study the tax code carefully, then one must ask a further question. Is there a countervailing incentive there? Is it perhaps possible that the desire for love might cancel out the enticements the tax code offers to remain single? And so you have to think about that. And so the method, the core of the method, and there are other elements that I'm not going to have time to talk about, some of which are really just for very big legislative projects. But the core of the method then is to analyze the bounds of the rationality of the group that's being regulated and look at countervailing incentives to try to figure out how law will affect behavior. Now, that may seem very simple, and in fact, you do see it in very good legal analysis like Ian Ayers and Robert Gantner's work on default rules in contract and corporate law, but you'd be amazed at how often this isn't done and what sort of strange results you sometimes get for leaving that out. So that's, in a nutshell, what I'm proposing then is this macroeconomic focus on avoiding systemic risk while keeping opportunities open. Well, that's the goal, excuse me. A focus on change over time and this economic dynamic method of analysis. Now, the economic dynamic method contrasts with the cost-benefit analysis as the proposed method invoked by neoclassical law and economics. Now, I say invoked because in a lot of areas of law it's not actually used. That is, in environmental law, we actually do carry out cost-benefit analysis of the law, and I think it's very unsatisfactory because the uncertainties are so great that it's doesn't work very well, but we do it. In many areas of the law, it sort of serves as a justificatory trope, but there is no cost-benefit analysis being carried out. For example, when Robert Bork and Richard Posner make their recommendations for antitrust, they say, well, we couldn't possibly do a cost-benefit analysis of a merger. We can't predict what the costs and benefits were. So what we do is we assume that the CEOs are rational actors with perfect information, and that means that in very many situations that mergers are likely to prove efficient, and therefore we don't need a lot of restrictions on these combinations. And that becomes a rationale then for stopping a lot of traditional antitrust enforcement, or was traditional at one time. So what's happening in that approach is that if you believe that market actors are possessed of perfect information and are rational, then it follows that, or if that's a reasonably good model of the world, it follows that you don't need government very often. So this becomes sort of a systematic way of arguing consistently for decline of government regulation, which brings me to the financial crisis. Neoclassical law and economics helped spur the financial crisis in the following way. It was the intellectual underpinning that led to the worldview that government regulation was suspect, sort of a presumption against government regulation because the market would take care of these things by itself. And that's not true that every financial to regulatory step was recommended by law and economics scholars, but this worldview is not just something in the legal academy or in economics faculties. This is being transmitted by corporate-funded think tanks that are very interested in this, and by corporations, being used in the messaging by corporations to try to get the financial regulatory structure that was put in place after the Great Depression and remained intact through a great period of post-war prosperity to dismantle it. Just about everything that occurred to create the financial crisis was illegal up through the mid-1970s. And I'll just tick off a few items. The mortgages offered subprime borrowers were variable rate mortgages. We have a teaser rate, and then it resets to the price in an index, which makes it very hard for the borrowers and sometimes the lenders to know what's actually going to happen in the transaction. That was illegal until it was made legal under the Reagan financial reform. Derivatives trades. At common law, speculative derivatives trades were unenforceable contracts. And the Commodity Futures Trading Commission had authority to regulate them, which it was seriously considering exercising. And Congress stripped the regulatory agency of the authority and preempted this 100-year-old rule, which would have no doubt made it very difficult to have derivatives markets go to the incredible size that they did on the eve of the financial crisis. The other thing that was, I think, crucial to the financial crisis was the existence of these two big failed institutions, or too big both in terms of size and in terms of the variety of the activities. And I say that because in 2007, a bunch of subprime mortgage lenders went out of business without any serious effect on the world economy. This turned into a crisis when players who were so vastly interconnected that they could affect the entire economy were threatened. And these institutions' existence was probably impossible under the prior framework, both because of restrictions on interstate banking, a statute that prohibited combining investment and commercial banking, so it was impossible to both securitize and originate loans in one institution. All that was legalized by President Clinton and the U.S. Congress when Glass-Steagall was repealed after a long period of regulatory erosion of the Glass-Steagall Act. It was also facilitated by weak antitrust enforcement, which might otherwise have prevented some of these mergers. So I think neoclassical law and economics has played a role, not all by itself, but has played a role in precipitating the financial crisis. Economic dynamic theory has also played a role in the crisis, in ameliorating it. That is, think about what regulators did when they decided to rescue the banks. They're looking at the shape of change over time, which is straight down. They're saying we have to countervail it. They're trying to avoid the manifestation of systemic risk. They are not balancing costs and benefits of the margins because they can't calculate the costs and the benefits of any particular intervention. Cannot be done. And they're not interested. That's not what they're doing. And then they're carrying out implicitly an economic dynamic analysis under bounded rationality that's telling them that if one of these institutions were to go under, what's going to happen is not a rational calculation of exactly what the liabilities are because nobody has the information. There'd be mass panic. There'd be a bank run and a collapse of the entire financial structure. That's when when they saw that economic dynamic, the regulators got serious about seeing to it that these institutions did not fail, because if they did, they take the whole economy with them, at least after Lehman Brothers' demise. In terms of the future, the economic dynamic theory suggests we need to take structural financial reform more seriously than we have. Financial regulation has traditionally made a lot of reliance on disclosure law. So requirements for disclosure of information to investors. This is an efficiency-enhancing idea that gives people the market, the information and make it possible for markets to work well. But Professor Schwartz has pointed out that past a certain point, when you get to these complex derivatives, you're getting measures that are so complicated that the best informed investors cannot understand it. And he wrote this before the financial crisis and explained that not even institutional investors can understand this. And so no amount of disclosure is going to help that. At that point, when you're into that kind of a world, you have to think about structural reform. So this suggests that you need to, if you're serious about avoiding systemic risk, you need to take a very careful look at reforms economists have recommended by breaking up too big to fail institutions and perhaps restricting or even eliminating derivatives. And we just haven't looked seriously enough at these kind of reforms, although that may be changing. Now, the theory, I think, has fairly obvious application in an area of potential disaster like this. I don't think its applicability to the common law is nearly as self-evident. And I want to start by conceding that I don't think avoidance of systemic risk is very central to the common law. It does come up, for example, in that common law rule against speculative derivatives trading in some context. But the idea of keeping economic opportunity open as a fundamental function of law is something that's important in the common law. You might think that the future orientation, shape of change over time orientation of this theory, the focus, is inapplicable to the common law, because the common law is commonly described as retrospective, but in fact, no legal action has any effect except prospective. When an injured victim comes before a tribunal and says, I've been in an accident, the other person's at fault, award me damages, what happens? Well, the day the damages are awarded, perhaps that person feels some solace. Their bills get paid from thereafter. The most powerful judge in the world cannot relieve the pain and suffering they already experienced. Not only that, the effect going forward may be that other defendants are going to be more careful, and maybe this defendant and other defendants will be more careful. That's why the general deterrence function that Guido Calabresi wrote about in The Cost of Accidents is so important. So when we engage in common law change and reform, it does address the shape of change over time. And economic dynamic analysis is a method that can apply a wide variety of goals, so it's no problem in no matter what your goals are in the common law as anywhere else. And you see economic dynamic theory playing a role, for example, in property law. Around the same time The Cost of Accidents came out, and the work on property, a little before the work on property and liability rules, you saw Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. Now, the Tragedy of Commons idea is simply this, that we have these commons resources that nobody owns, like the oceans, the air, or a pasture upon which everybody's sheep may graze. And it happens that if owners put sheep out on the commons, they get all the benefits from adding more sheep to their herds, but pay only a fraction of the cost of the degradation of the land. That's shared with other owners. So everybody has an incentive to add sheep. The result is degradation and perhaps destruction of the resource. And this theory this theory has predicted very serious consequences that come to pass. So you have like the depletion of ocean fisheries and other phenomena that follow this model of the tragedy of the commons. Now, So notice what this does. It's focused on the shape of change over time, where are we headed. It examines in many contexts the systemic risk. And in Garrett Hardin's hands, actually, it's using just rational actor assumptions. But subsequent work by Robert Ellickson and Eleanor Ostrom has looked more carefully at how norms are incorporated in people that may ameliorate this, and has come up with, therefore, a better analysis of the tragedy of the commons. So you see a model there. I think we could do more with this. One of the more interesting things going on in property law is titling reforms, where Hernando de Soto said, well, one of the problems with economic development is we have a lot of poor people around the world, especially in developing countries, who have informal property, but they can't do much with it because it's held illegally. So they need to formalize their ownership rights, and that this would be a great economic growth method. Well, this is a proposal to enhance economic opportunity in a very important way that could contribute to this macroeconomic growth that would be one of the targets of a macroeconomic theory. At the same time, it poses systemic risks in many contexts because there can be land conflicts in these kind of situations. There are often people or governments that have formal title. There is potential for social instability in these kind of reforms. And so it needs very careful analysis, and I think the economic dynamic analysis should be there. I have to say I'm going to have to go through this because of the time limits pretty quickly. I don't have time to thoroughly defend anything about the common law, really. I'm just going to give a few results, and I'm going to have to leave it at that and refer you to the book or for questions to do any more. Contracts. Now, contract law, you would think, would be the natural home of neoclassical law and economics, because after all, microeconomics is focused on contracts as sort of a paradigmatic situation. And I would agree that actually neoclassical legal economic theory does a great job of explaining contract formation. People engage in contracts in order to realize mutual gains. I don't think there's much doubt about that. I would say, however, a central purpose of contract law is to enforce inefficient bargains. That may seem counterintuitive, but let me explain. Often, when people contract, they figure the benefits to them outweigh the cost. They make a contract, the time for performance comes, the benefits still outweigh the cost, they perform. What ends up sending contracts into court? Well, very often what has happened is something has happened in between, price rises occurred in some materials, something has happened so that the deal is no longer worthwhile to one party. That is, the cost of performance have come to outweigh the benefits, yet the court enforces the contract anyway. And that is the normal situation, that the contract is inefficient at the time it gets to the court. It was conceived of, it was efficient, but at time two, it's not efficient, and yet the courts do enforce these contracts. Now, Guido taught us to pay attention to the exceptions to rules very carefully, and they can often be revealing. The exception to this rule is doctrines of impossibility and impracticability, and the courts are quite clear that they're not looking at the relation between costs and benefits on the few occasions when they excuse performance. They're looking at unusual circumstances that may have caused a problem. And I think the reason they're doing that is they're trying to create a macroeconomic environment that facilitates contract formation so we can have cooperation and lots of deals that generate economic growth. So that's a key purpose of this. And you see that purpose partly in the exceptions, but you cannot say, it seems to me, the contract law has a central does not force efficient bargains. It's, on the contrary, all about enforcing inefficient bargains so people can cooperate and create economic good. How much time? 5 minutes. I'd like to back up on one point, which is, one thing that I think merits a little more explanation is the relationship between efficiency and these sort of macroeconomic goals of providing economic opportunity. And I think the idea that efficiency is that critical to wealth maximization is a little bit off track. A lot of economic growth comes from innovation, not from efficient allocation. In fact, a lot of important economic growth is very inefficient. For example, if you buy anything online, you are the beneficiary of millions of inefficient transactions. Because Amazon.com, which was the pioneer in this area, went on a money-losing strategy of offering people low prices and deal after deal after deal in order to create this market. And this kind of risky, inefficient behavior is common in economic growth. You have new technologies that cause explosions in factories. That's not desirable necessarily, but creativity and with it some inefficiency is part of the economic growth process. So it seems to me, I'm not saying that efficiency doesn't have any value, but it's a less important goal to be efficient than it is to avoid systemic risks and facilitate economic opportunity for people. So with that, I'll conclude. If this intrigues you, by the way, I've got flyers on the book out in the back table there. I think the economic dynamic approach creates a healthier relationship between law and economics by trying to get economics to look at law, the most important goals in law, not just the ones that have been chosen because they're useful conveniences for modeling and describing markets. In some ways, it builds upon and systemizes ideas pioneered in the cost of accidents. And I think one of the virtues of the theory is it focuses on the most important goals we have, the most important economic goals we have. There are non-economic goals that are important too, but the most important economic goals we have are that of avoiding catastrophes while providing economic opportunity for people. And the economic dynamic approach provides an alternative that can be useful in a wide variety of areas of law. So with that, I'll take questions.
My hearing is less good, and so I didn't catch everything that you said. So if I missed some things, please correct me. I looked at the paper, but one thing that I wonder is how much are you talking about macroeconomics and macro law and economics and economic analysis of law in terms of the structure of a whole system, crises, and things of that sort, which has an interesting story because from the time I went to Yale, Gene Rostow wanted a course in macro law and economics and never could get anybody to teach it. He tried to get Bob Bork to do it, which, considering the antitrust relationship would, but he never could get anyone, and he was very frustrated because he thought it was crucially important, but evidently it was too difficult. And how much are you talking instead about a dynamic side of microeconomics, which I think a lot of what you're talking about also is, which is also hard, but is a little different. Now, I think what you want is a dynamic side of macro, which is the hardest of both. But sometimes when you talk, I think you are suggesting that law and economics, even at the micro level, would be much better if it were more open to dynamic. And for example, one almost never hears the name Schumpeter. You know, it's quite interesting, but think about what introducing Schumpeter into the analysis of the existence of laws, and put that together with Grant Gilmore, who fought, this legal realist, who thought that you should always create laws because it was the best we could do at any given moment in the chaos that was humanity. But then we had to destroy those laws because they would become out of date very soon. And if you start thinking of that from a Schumpeterian point of view, you start thinking, oh, my goodness, there's a whole other side of that. So it seems to me that you've got a handle on. You are talking about the need to do things, and you are doing some things in something which is even bigger than you've yet gotten. So a tiger by the tail, and a darn good one, but thank goodness you're young.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, obviously I'm most interested in this goal of avoiding systemic risk, because I do think this is the world we live in. And focusing on the efficiency too much in too many areas is diverting us from some real key problems that need economic talent. And I also think some financial reforms are being unduly restricted, because we look at this and say, gee, we might lose some transactions. Well, the economy is pretty dynamic. It can make up for some lost transactions. It's not going to make up for a repeat of this crisis, which you could well get. And there's several areas where I have this fear. So I think that is, the major goal of the theory, is to precisely look at the structure in this broader way. I think you're right, though, also in saying that the economic dynamic approach can improve the microeconomic analysis of law. I think that's absolutely right. In fact, it can improve the analysis of justice. You made justice a part of efficiency. I'm not quite sure if I agree with that or not, but whether it's part of it or not, I think this approach, anytime you're interested in the consequences of legal rules, this is a better approach, to simply study the actual bounds of the people you're regulating. You don't have to know everything, but you need to know something about their habits, or people might be institutions, identities, and habits and routines, so you can predict what kind of information they pay attention to and how they might act, and look at the important countervailing influences. And you can do this in financial regulation. One of the things we learned is financial institutions engage in herd behavior. Investors can react with exuberance and fear. That has to be front and center when we're doing this kind of reform.